Jordan Regine, founder of Peace, Love, Freedom, and Geospatial Strategy Consultant. Pleasure to have you on the Geospatial Index.
Thank you. Well, appreciate it, man. Happy to be here.
Excellent. All right. So, as with all businesses, you're on the chopping block. So, let's start off with the elevator pitch for Peace, Love, Freedom.
Yeah, so Peace Love Freedom exists to help our clients access expertise from across the geospatial value chain so they can efficiently navigate market, regulatory, normative, and technological structures to produce and deploy geospatial technology capable of solving the most challenging problems at scale with maximum profitability. So I know that's like a mouthful, but at the core of it, we help bring system solutions spanning people, processes, and technology and regulatory environments so that our customers can be successful as they grow.
Excellent. So, just to help listeners understand or unpack that a bit, what niche do you dominate?
I dominate the niche of geospatial data acquisition and processing. So my origins were in proprietary base map development. And so I really had my feet to the fire, just kind of learned in the cauldron of geospatial data acquisition how to erect organizations capable of collecting, processing, and publishing insane amounts of geospatial data that are of a really high quality and ready for consumers to deploy in their daily lives or business solutions and find success with.
Cool. So geospatial data can kind of be about anything, from radon gas emissions to help identify potential cancer clusters, to what you've got in your background there. Is there a bit of a bias in your practice towards elevation data, perhaps, in terms of geospatial data?
My practice is definitely biased towards aerial and street level imagery and LiDAR acquisition. So that does, especially in the aerial applications, tend to gravitate towards elevation. And with elevation, you can derive so many different things that, it's really a critical foundational data layer that I think is embedded into pretty much any geospatial software that's worth its salt today, but gets very little recognition as something that drives some of the most advanced spatial analysis processes that people are working with.
Okay. Do you want to tell listeners a little bit about what exactly is behind you?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the American Southwest in colors that are really personal to me. I grew up in this region here. If I move my head, it's not really going to pop up. But this is New Mexico, and then the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. So I spent, obviously, I was born and raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then spent my summers and winters skiing and camping throughout the wilderness of Colorado. And then my family history and ancestry is very dominated in this region here of the Pueblo Indians and the Spanish incursion up through the south. But the color palette, I just love visualizing elevation in really kind of crazy color palettes because you never know what's going to pop when you set things a little differently. But this blue here, the lowest elevation are my company colors. Peace, Love, Freedom is blue, red, orange, and yellow. The next is next after the Peace, Love, Freedom yellow is the New Mexico yellow. That's where I started. Green is my favorite color. Blue, this is the Duke blue here. That's where I did my undergrad. And then the gold that you can see at these higher elevations are the CU buff. That's where I went to law school. And then white represents the highest elevations. And that is, it's the future is unknown. It's yet to be written. So we'll see what occupies the highest elevations moving forward. So I like this very personal background, but I think it's a pretty cool representation of the Southwest.
No other guest has put so much effort in to the background. Really great to have a true appreciation of elevation data on the podcast. Great.
Thank you.
What was also going through my mind is actually my one is something you can derive from elevation data, which is some building footprints actually in Atlanta, where I'm living these days. So what's the skin in the game of the owner/management/staff?
So skin in the game, I think aligning incentives is really at the core of my value structure. And that means, like you said, having skin in the game. So as the company grows, not only do I want to well, our customers and clients to experience success, but anyone who's associated in producing that success, I think needs to have a stake in the fruits of that success, right? So it's important to me to get beyond the hourly and salary models of old that I don't think really align incentives to producing positive outcomes. Uh, Hourly work, you're looking at incentivizing taking longer, not necessarily producing higher quality. Salary work, it's do as little as possible in the time that you have, and then check out. But with a balance of hourly salary and incentive bonuses or incentive structures based off of revenue, customer success, customer retention, and things that are very directly tied and measurable to the revenue and profitability structure of the company. The folks who are either within my partnership network or working directly with Peace, Love, Freedom stand to benefit as well. So to me, that looks like with employees, equity, having a stake of equity. We have 15% of the company value set aside to our employee equity pool. And then with my partnership network, that looks like revenue share. The more that we bring customers into the fold and produce valuable results for them, and we are recognized for that through growing revenue, that gets kicked back to partnership, the folks who are helping to make that happen. So very much what you put in, you get a portion of that back out.
Good to hear. That's how you, yeah, as you said, incentivize performance. Right then, so who's your ideal customer and how do you ensure that you're always working backwards from their needs?
So ideal customer, I really like to dominate the space of small and medium-sized businesses, whether that's in data acquisition and processing. Folks who have been around for 5 to 10 years and have kind of experienced a growth plateau. Maybe that's a family business, and they're really looking to get to the next level and start taking on more contracts. And how can we build an organization capable of moving beyond our current capacities? Startups that are looking to aggressively scale, and then construction, utility, or service companies that are integrating geospatial technology into their critical business systems. But the thread that weaves all of these together is they're doing something right to begin with, and they just need that help to understand how do we build these systems in our business around the technology that we have in order to take it to the next level, and really start to grow in a sustainable way.
The conferences you attend, is there a structured interview process or a regular industry survey that you do to detect, remain aware of customer needs?
The way we do that is detailed interviews to understand what are they really trying to accomplish. Not just what do they think they're trying to accomplish, but what's the vision of the company? What is the actual solution that their customers need? And how can we, from a foundational level, make moves and organize the business, and not just from a strategy or a tactical level, but from a values, a vision, and that entire ecosystem of your company in order to satisfy those end users who are actually deploying the technology and putting it to work on a daily basis. So for me, it's all about what is the problem that we're trying to solve, and not just taking like a myopic view of, well, this is how it's always been done, or this is how everyone else is doing it, but how can we solve this problem according to our values and vision in order to create the highest chances and levels of success for our end users.
Yeah. Okay. Just a side question. Are there any conferences in the US, industry conferences, that you attend to help you remain aware of what your customers need?
For sure. My favorite conferences have been NISTIC. Obviously, I one of my foundational clients is the National States Geospatial Information Council. It's a nonprofit organization started by state governors in the 90s to help coordinate and align geospatial activities between states so they can share information, best practices, and spend taxpayer dollars more efficiently. And so NISTIC is where not only state governments, federal employees, private companies, there's a huge stakeholder ecosystem that exists within the NISTIC conferences that I find incredibly valuable because you get the value chain between the data acquisition, processing, and the folks who are actually putting it together and using it in the field, whether it's parks or DOTs, things like that. So NISTIC, those conferences are excellent. They have a spring conference and a summer conference. Those are really fun. And then MAPS, as I really work a lot in the data acquisition and processing space, MAPS is an organization comprised of a lot of engineering, surveying firms, mostly aerial acquisition is represented at MAPS, but also you get vendors or business partners who are in the processing and geospatial platform space. So that's a good place to find out what's happening on the front end of the geospatial value chain. And then, of course, Esri Partners Conference. I find that the Esri User Conference is a little more showy, and there's just so many people there. There's a lot going on, but the Partner Conference tends to be a little smaller and still a lot of energy, and you can find out what are people building, what are they building it for, who are their customers, what technology is Esri coming out with, and although I don't personally play around too much in the Esri space myself. A lot of my customers do, and so it's important to understand what's going on in that ecosystem, and how I can support them better by bringing different solutions that play well within the Esri environment to the table.
So I guess if I could sum up, are you, in a sense, a management consultant for geospatial data acquisition companies?
I think that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
There we go. Okay, so that's why it makes total sense for you to attend those pools of those companies that you can improve their business efficiency.
Exactly. So I don't come from a technical GIS background. I come very much from an organizational, operational, like how do we organize around solving these problems? And the unique proposition that I bring to the table is not just how do we create an org structure, but how do we integrate that with our finance team, with our legal team to understand the risks and manage those risks? And then how do we make sure that that's being communicated into our sales and marketing teams so that we can not just sell and get customers, but deliver on those promises by developing a really solid product and product delivery organization behind that. So it's very much a systems approach to geospatial organization and operations.
Yep. Okay. How fast and sticky is growth?
It's not as fast and sticky as I would like.
Everyone says that.
Really, it's sticky. Growth is the customers that I have are fantastic, and I really love working with them. And from what I've heard, they really love working with me, and so that's fantastic. The rate of growth, I think most companies, I think they'd like their rate of growth to be a little faster. But in this industry, I think it really is all about relationships and strategic growth and taking on the right projects. I've learned early in my practice, and maybe not early enough, that the right customer is better than a high-paying customer, and so that's something I've integrated into my customer acquisition strategy now. And I'm in a place where I can be very picky about who I take on next, and so that I want to be very careful about the folks that I work with to make sure that I'm bringing maximum value to them, and they are people that I really enjoy working with and will find value in my services, and that we can be long-term partners, not just a short-term stepping stone. I want to provide that service over the long haul.
Yeah, it's nice to hear you have that level of success where you can use your discretion in who gives you revenue.
I'm very fortunate in that respect. Very fortunate.
Great. Okay, so let's step through some examples of work you've done over the course of your career. And this brings us to how I actually found out about you. So I read this really impressive description of some work you did for Bing Maps on your LinkedIn profile. So what did you do for them, and what made Uber like it so much that they bought the solution that you worked on?
Yeah, so Bing Maps is really where I got my start in the geospatial industry as a professional. Um, I didn't I didn't know it growing up that geospatial or GIS was something that you could do as a career path. But I always loved maps. And sorry, I will weave back.
Huh?
It's hard for me to tell the story of Bing Maps without setting a foundation of like, what did I have any business doing there in the first place? But I was always that kid. I had two brothers growing up, and we had these placemats, and one of them was of the presidents of the United States. One of them was like dinosaurs, and the other one was on one side it was a political boundary map of the United States, and the other side it was the ecosystems and the like, that stylized here's the forests and the plains, and that was the one that I always demanded. I studied political science in college because I loved the maps and history books and how borders changed. That was always really fascinating to me. And then, my first job out of college was as in the conservation corps, building trails, and mapping and navigating and wayfinding was a huge aspect to that in the Colorado wilderness. And so, and I've been collecting trail
All
maps.
of us are so jealous right now.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I'm very fortunate for the path that I've had in life. Been very very lucky to grow up where there are wide spaces and physical maps, and having the opportunity to fall in love with them in a very physical way. I'm very fortunate for that. But I moved to the Front Range shortly after after a little more than a summer working with the Conservation Corps for my first big boy job, I guess. And I got to work in a technical staffing firm, which was awesome. The people were great, but the path was a sales path, and I've pretty quickly realized sales wasn't my thing. It's still not really my thing, but as a business owner, I have to make it my thing. But anyway, I told them, hey, this isn't really my career path that I'm looking for. I'm gonna step away and go find something else, and I'll serve out my term here. Towards the end of that notice period, they landed a giant contract with Microsoft and asked me to run it for them because they had seen the way that I was technical in the office. I was, kind of like an on-site help desk kind of a guy, and I had leadership experience in my past and could work with clients pretty well. So they asked me to lead this project at Microsoft. It was taking a 50-person pilot project to build street-level cities, or street side is the Microsoft branded version, and 3D cities for Microsoft Bing Maps. So I started working out of the Boulder office. We transitioned a team from the previous vendor manager and quickly realized, wow, 50 people is not enough to accomplish this really ambitious goal of producing 70 aerially derived 3D cities and 40 street side cities by, I think it was like November 14th or something like that. And for context, this was back in 2013, so it's pretty early in the game. But their goal was to meet or exceed the quality of Google Maps. Google Maps was the giant in the game at that point. Had a pretty robust street side or street view catalog, and their 3D cities were impressive for the time, but if you looked back at them now, it'd be like looking back at like an N64 video game, right?
Sure.
You're like, whoa.
So was it like a 3 months? You said November. So when did it start? In 2015?
So we took on the contract in early July. So we had about 5 months, a little less than 5 months to knock out these cities. And they had a data backlog. They had been collecting aerial data for a little while, and street side data as part of their pilot project. So we had a data backlog, but what we realized, so we were a vendor team that sat on site with the Microsoft project management and engineering team in the Boulder office. It was located in Boulder because they had this data center in Longmont, Colorado, just up the block outside of the IBM facility there that had like this sweetheart deal with Xcel Energy for this insane uptime. So this data center just rode on the coattails of that IBM processing facility to have this really sweetheart contract, so they didn't lose power ever, pretty much. And we had a really nice fat pipe to that data center, and we were processing petabytes of data within this office. But what the Microsoft engineering team found out pretty quickly was that their post-processing models weren't as efficient as they originally anticipated. And so when they had signed up for this really ambitious goal of producing 70 aerial cities and 40 street-side cities by November to the corporate leadership, they were using numbers that didn't turn out to be realistic when it came down to the rubber hitting the road, right? And so the way we got around that was by leveraging the operational capacity of the vendor team. So we pretty much maxed out the occupancy capacity. I mean, this was insane. We went from 50 staff on my team alone to over 180 in 4 weeks. So we spun up a national recruiting pipeline. We were interviewing hundreds, if not thousands, of candidates. The partner and I that we had on the project ended up doing all the final interviews, and then I was responsible for all of the equipment procurement, the access provisioning, the onboarding, the organizing the training, making sure that my direct reports, who were responsible for the discrete processing and operational functions, were working effectively, and we had an organization that could scale from 50 to 180. It's not that big of a jump, but it, like, over that short of a time, you have to make sure that you have a seamless, like, working machine in people that you can elevate to the positions that where you need them, so that you can process this data to quality within a budget and within the timeline that we had. It was probably the most fun I've ever had in my career. It was awesome. We're like working around the clock, seriously. I can go on all day. Sorry, I should add a little structure here.
I can really see how you could leverage that amazing experience in a consulting career for other organizations that may want to, in some small way, even approach that scale of operation. So, I mean, everyone must be after some interesting stories about this incredible capture program. So maybe if we could have an example of something interesting that went down, or a day in the life of someone doing the street side capture, and what the nature of the aerial capture was, satisfy people's curiosity, because all of us in our day-to-day lives, we just bring up this stuff on our phones. Here's our chance. Everyone wants to hear what goes on in the background.
Yeah, it's in the background. I think that where the sausage is made, I think, is the most fascinating part of it to me, and that's why I fell in love with what I call geospatial operations. The activities around collecting data in the real world, bringing it back to where you have the computational ability and the power to process it, and then the human capacity to actually produce it into something that you can publish, and people will look at and say, wow, this is really great. I can start using this in my products or to make decisions with.
So did you have like 20 people driving cars around, and did you knock off one city at a time? I mean, just that, and the planning, and different sections of there must be territories. How did you handle all that?
Yeah, this is, my memory will conflate certain things here. So we started with around 12 street side sensors strapped to, I think, RAV4s at the time on Thule racks. And we went up to over 100 at one point, distributed across the country. And so for the original so the Microsoft project spans a little over 2 years. The original push for 7040, we had a data backlog, so we weren't relying too much on data flowing in, because we had that backlog from the pilot project. But after 7040 is what we called it, after the November of 2013, we scaled street side production even further to accommodate the building of a proprietary base map. That was the goal. So it wasn't just about having 40 cities that are major metropolitan areas. The goal was, let's map 95% of U.S. roads. And so for that endeavor, man, it was quite a feat. So the strategy that we took was to have roving squads of a roving fleet, essentially. So we had a central hub of dispatchers within our office in Boulder who were responsible for creating AOIs and delivering them to the drivers and taking any sort of, you know, updates or problems with the drivers and helping them troubleshoot them in the field. The drivers, we had 2 drivers per vehicle, and I think we had 10 vehicles, 10 to 12 per squad, and we had 10 squads operating around the country. And so we would find a hub where we can recruit from, and then we were recruiting like old UPS drivers, taxi drivers, delivery drivers, folks who had experience in a driving capacity and were professionals in that manner. And then we would pair them up with folks that we thought, they would work well with. And that was actually one of the biggest challenges, is when you have folks working in teams,
Driving
where do you
for 8 hours a day for months.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, it's easy when you're in their hometown because they just go home to sleep. But once you start moving a certain distance away from their hometown, now you have to start thinking about, where are we going to store these vehicles with these expensive sensors? Where are we going to put these folks up for the night? How can we accommodate them as a team? So we had folks sharing rooms, right? Which isn't always the most ideal thing from an interpersonal perspective, but from a cost perspective, it saved the program an exorbitant amount. So they weren't sharing beds, but they did have a shared room. So it was like, how do we strike this balance between making sure that we're taking care of our folks in the field, but also executing on this project within the time frame that we have to execute on it and the budget that we have to do. So, we over the life of the project, we experienced less than 5% voluntary attrition, which I think was pretty astounding given the rigor of the work and the
But I can imagine people would feel a sense of mission and purpose, because it's like, one of the largest sort of, inhaling a whole country. I reckon people would have felt proud to be involved.
Well, that was our secret weapon, really, is at the end of the day, I would pinpoint the biggest factor to our success was the ability of project management, not just myself, but the Microsoft team leadership, to recognize that this was a huge, audacious project that we can be excited and proud to be a part of. And so we recognized pretty early on that we need to use this to our advantage to motivate folks and make them feel as though that they're part of something really incredible, because they were. And so every week, every Friday, we would host all-hand meetings, at least during the 70-40 push, to demonstrate what work we were able to get done that week, identify folks who were notable contributors to that, pull up AOIs that were really interesting and fascinating, that had a lot of really talented, and I'm kind of jumping all around here, but like we had a team of 30 really talented 3D artists on staff that would just do amazing things. Like in Australia, the opera house, right? Getting those curves and those overhangs and making it look just right, so it looked like you were almost there in person. Showcasing that work for the entire building to see, and then celebrating as a team, and not just recognizing it through words and through celebration, but through monetary reward as well, right? So we had incentive programs to really recognize folks who went above and beyond, and to just make people feel good about the work that they were doing.
Okay, so that signpost that eventually this program went global, I'd like to go there with a story in a bit. How many planes did you have flying, and have you got any stories from the challenges shepherding those?
Yeah, the planes, that was a whole another beast. We had, at the time, Vexcel was still under the Microsoft umbrella, so we were flying Vexcel sensors. Um, I think we had between 12 and 24. I don't remember what we had during 70/40. I think at our peak we had 24 sensors flying, and we were leveraging different vendors around the country to actually execute on the flying. Compass Data provided us with all of our ground control points. And so the biggest challenge there was making sure we had sun angle. We were strictly, I believe we were strictly leaf off is what we were looking for to prevent any sort of crazy tree action. And then sun duration, right? And so that made our flight windows really particular. So we had to always be ready if there were weather events in our priority AOYs to have alternative AOYs within a reasonable regional distance so that we could pivot and collect within those limited flight windows. Not too different than what folks are doing today, although I think depending on the application, leaf off is not is unnecessary. But for what we were doing, having leaf off was super helpful.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, it's amazing. Just to get a bit of a feel of the vibe of what went on and the scale you have to think about. The idea, the pressure of having to be able to quickly retask an expensive plane to another area. Sounds like something that would keep you on your toes. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is when you have a data backlog, it makes things a lot easier. But the biggest one of the biggest challenges through the Microsoft experience was, we built up this huge operational capacity to process and produce imagery, building footprints, all sorts of derivative products from the LiDAR and imagery source data. Exactly. Microsoft's building footprints. My team was trained the original algorithms responsible for those. But to maintain that operational capacity, you have to find a certain backlog where you can support a reasonable amount of that staff through the low seasons of acquisition, right? So again, it's all about balance. How do you maintain a processing throughput where you're hitting the publishing objectives and the data delivery objectives while maintaining a reasonable backlog so that you can support your staff through those low periods and avoid unnecessary attrition so that when the high period of acquisition inevitably comes again, you have enough of your talent retained
You
to
don't have a
quickly
hiring
deploy
lag.
and ramp back up.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, a large set of moving pieces in this puzzle.
Yeah, it was fun.
Cool. So then it sounded like you guys succeeded because then at some point there was a push to a global scale. So could you tell us a bit more there?
Yeah, exactly. So we did succeed in delivering the Microsoft's first 70 aerial cities, 3D cities, and 40 street-side cities on the pretty much on the hour. We published the last city for that objective. Big celebration across 182 people. We averaged 63 hours a week, which it turned out to 63.8. Our goal was 63, which is an incredible feat, using pretty much all carrots in that incentive package. Obviously, there were some normative pressures like, hey, we're all doing this.
Good old peer pressure. Excellent.
Good old peer pressure. But I don't know. From my perspective, I believe in really leading from the front, right? So I think I averaged 90-hour weeks through that time period. It was a lot of fun, but it was exhausting. But that led into the continuation of the program for another couple of years, and we successfully delivered city after city on time, under budget, every single month. So we were shipping cities, eventually amassing aerial data, aerial 3D data for over 75% of the U.S. population and 95% of U.S. roads. Microsoft went international in the sense that we did start collecting Canada and Mexico, but the true international effort, aerial was all over the world. That was international from the beginning. It's a lot it's a lot easier to collect a lot more data from the sky than it is from the road. But the true international street level effort that I was part of really got started with Uber, the transition to Uber.
Okay, so what happened?
Well, I think at one point Microsoft realized that mapping was
And
not
I
at the.
should ask, does this relate to another one of your LinkedIn posts?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Um, yeah, so when you're getting in the business of building a proprietary base map, it's pretty important to know what you're going to do with that and have it be like at the core of your business model, unless you're just have a ton of money to spend. At the time, Microsoft, they were going through a reorganization, a corporate reorg. I think they realized the expense of not only developing the proprietary base map from the outset, but the cost of maintaining it over time was just so high that, and it was so far afield from their core business model that they just couldn't justify it. I mean, Bing Maps still exist, and Flight Simulator, they just issued a new version which leverages a lot of the mapping technology that I think came out of that program and that Microsoft has been working on for a long time. But building a base map to the level that we were doing was just not something that they wanted to continue. So they ended up selling the project to Uber, and Uber as a rideshare point to point, they were starting to expand into new markets like food delivery. They at the time had a huge eye, or the apple of their eye was autonomous vehicle and autonomous taxis, right? And so for that business model, it's all about where are people and things and how do we move them to the places where they want to go or can be more productive. And so having a proprietary base map to get off of Google's pretty stringent and not very flexible mapping platform was important to them. So we started collecting. I mean, we leveraged the Microsoft Street Side data to start fueling and building that proprietary base map for Uber, extracting all sorts of data from that imagery, like addresses, street names, business names, you name it. Something that you're interested that you can see in a picture. We were out there drawing bounding boxes around it and training algorithms to extract that and provide and build that raw data tools that our cartographers can then use to piece together those base maps and train huge amounts of people to do that at scale. But yeah, so Uber, we started going internationally to collect. We're in London, Mexico, Canada. We hit South Africa, Australia, numerous places in Southeast Asia. And that was a lot of fun. A lot of different crazy things happening when you're collecting thousands and thousands and thousands of kilometers of street side data.
All right, so needless to say, tell us a crazy story. I seem to recall there might have been something that happened in South Africa.
Yeah. Yeah, in
Unless
South
there's an
Africa.
even crazier story.
South Africa, I think the craziest part of the South African story is that our operations were just minorly inconvenienced for a few hours, So South Africa, we were collecting out, I believe outside of Johannesburg, and our strategy was to deploy operational folks to go out, scout the area, find warehouses, line up partnerships, identify drivers, train them up, and then train local leads on how the process works, and then move to another city, and then let that city run autonomously for a little while, package up all those sensors, and then move them to the next city. So we would have this leapfrog effect where you could launch a city, run that city, and then go to the next one. So we had, Uber's very cost conscious at the time. It had a pretty high valuation, but this was a project that, while it was core to their business, ultimately it wasn't necessarily a revenue driver, right? It was a cost saver. So it was all about cost savings. So our warehouse was pretty much on the edge of the city, not in the most reputable place. But our really expensive equipment and hard drives and all of this cutting edge technology was co-located with diapers in this warehouse. And it turns out like diapers are a really hot commodity on the black market, I guess. And so at
As
one
opposed to street level imaging sensors that are not
yeah,
hot
exactly.
commodities on the black market. It's like,
Exactly. The resale value of those sensors is not great, let me tell you. Um, so, so one day these, box truck rolls up with guys wielding um, Kalashnikovs, the AK-47s, and they come out. They zip tie our staff and hold them hostage while they ransack this warehouse of all of the diapers that they could find, leaving all of our sensors and everything behind. Um, and then they drove off. And so while it was a traumatic experience for the folks involved. They got bruised and scuffed up a little bit. Um, at the end of the day, they were pretty great, and they're some pretty hardy guys. Some of them had ex-military experience. So it
it's
turned
just,
out to be a little bit of a speed bump, not too impactful, but it was definitely a learning experience of, man, we really need to make sure that we vet our locations a little more and ramp up our security and make sure our guys are safe. But
God.
it just goes to show, like, you never really know what's going to happen out there.
I just love this image of a bunch of guys coming in with Kalashnikovs to steal the diapers. Yeah, and ignoring the millions and millions and millions of dollars of, yeah, it's a great story. It just
Wow.
makes me feel like I've finally found my niche, speaking of niches, as a podcaster, which is to find the stories behind all of these massive base mapping efforts. Because we've had Stephanie May talking about the one for Apple Maps, and then what she did for Facebook. There are also a couple of global base maps she put together for Amazon. So it's amazing to get the stories, and I think it's necessary for our industry for all of us to know the stories because the guys that have been involved, like self, we all really want to know about them. So yeah,
Honestly, that's the thing is, I think a lot of the industry it is so broad. It's really interesting when you talk to folks outside of the geospatial industry. They'll say, wow, that's a really specific niche that you're working in. And I'm like, man, I don't know. I don't know if I'm niched down enough, to be honest.
right.
It's the geospatial value chain is so broad, from data acquisition and processing all the way through platform and app development and integration into,
Yeah,
different types of business
it might be
systems.
a
It's
well-defined niche, but in the end, the niche is about inhaling a planet. So yeah.
Oh yeah, exactly. That's really well put. That's really well put. And the thing that's fascinating to me is, how do you go about physically inhaling the planet, right? And I think that's a lot of the industry focuses on, the products and the data that comes on the back end of all of these really operationally intensive and logistically complicated processes to actually do that inhalation
Yeah.
and data acquisition.
Yeah, so speaking of, I guess, ride hailing and delivery companies' interest in these data products, a recent addition to the Geospatial Index was Grab. They're a Southeast Asian, I think, delivery and taxi company. And they have actually developed really high detail maps for a number of Southeast Asian cities that they're now selling to other companies such as Microsoft and other companies that need to have a global integrated base map. So that's
Nice.
an example of how this effort continues, and it just makes me think, because of course there must be a number of efforts just in China as well. Beidou Maps, and Yandex in Russia. It'd be fantastic just to somehow keep the wave going. So if you can network me to the next person, I can tell that story too.
Yeah,
Oh,
I think so. I
cool.
think some guys at TomTom might be interested in that. I don't know.
Yep. Yeah, they're another, definitely another one at the center of HD mapping. Yeah, particularly.
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, great to hear this progression and these stories. As I understand it, there was a transition then at some point in your career where you studied law. Um, and I'm signposting here, I guess, another LinkedIn article that you wrote about how the Fourth Amendment applies to our profession. Could we have a bit of commentary here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just a little background. The Uber project, it was awesome. We got into a point where it was kind of running on autopilot. We had a great team and they were executing. We had moved past that let's figure it out zone, which is where I really bring the most value to the table. And through that work, when we're moving people across international boundaries, the legal team tends to get really highly involved. And law school was something I had always wanted to do. I took my LSAT, the entrance exam, when I was still an undergrad. And so I was not only getting more exposure to working with corporate legal teams between Uber and Insight Global, the company that I worked for, but I guess in legal speak, the statute of limitations on the entrance exam was coming up. It was the last year that I could apply. So I decided, you know what, I would like to increase my value that I can bring to organizations by, going and studying law and being a part of these critical conversations at a higher level. So I took that opportunity to go to CU Law, where they have a really robust telecommunications imprint on the national level, as well as a really sophisticated astrophysics department. And I focused on commercial satellite law and policy with an emphasis on not just telecommunications, but Earth observation. So, how do we get these birds in the sky and how are they regulated and how can we, think about the business cases around them? So graduated from law school in 2020 and decided not to practice. So any legal conversation that I have needs to be couched in the fact that I am not an attorney. I'm not licensed to give legal advice, and anything and everything I say with regard to the law is my personal opinion, and you should talk to a licensed attorney if you're looking for legal advice. That
I'll
said,
include that text in the video description too, needless to say.
Perfect. Yeah, I find that my talents and interests are much better leveraged from an operational capacity on the ground as a systems integrator than in the legal silo.
Perhaps we can signpost here. I think his name is Kevin Pomfret.
Yes.
He has the geospatial law handle on Bluesky, for example. So yeah, he is, as far as I understand, a practicing attorney. So if anyone has any interest for further opinions beyond those you may hesitantly express here, he's someone you may wish to reach out to.
He's a fantastic resource, incredible guy. He's really nice too. I love having the constant. What the law school gave me was a perspective on, how can we navigate legal and regulatory channels while also maximizing our business's potential to solve problems and make money and improve our ability to help people improve their lives, right? So
what is because as you can tell, I'm a foreigner. So perhaps we can start with just the innocent question to help the foreigners out who haven't done the civics education that a school student would have in the US. What is the Fourth Amendment?
So the Fourth Amendment is the limitation on the government against unreasonable search and seizure. So it essentially says that the government has to go through due process. It has to go through a certain process to determine whether or not the subject of a search or seizure of property, it's appropriate to do that. So, the Constitution, the Constitution itself is essentially a frame. What really makes it unique, and what makes the United States unique, is the idea that the government doesn't have natural powers, right? We are granting, the people are granting the government these powers, and you will operate within these confines that we're establishing, and all of those other powers that are not listed in the Constitution are reserved for states and the citizens, right? So the amendments essentially constrain the federal government, and then by extension the states, on their ability to act, essentially, and to strip power from people and organizations.
Okay, so when it comes to geospatial, I suspect the word seizure or that part of the Fourth Amendment is less of a concern. What you're sort of flagging in your post on LinkedIn or article on LinkedIn is search, and that, you know, with these 120 roving sensors in teams of 12, 10 teams of 12 across the country, and, you know, 50 aircraft, people's backyards can be detailed down to the centimeter. Is that kind of the implication you're discussing? And
yeah, exactly. And so the point of my post is the liberty implications of geospatial. And so to me, liberty, you know, it is the idea that people have natural rights, and the Constitution recognizes these natural rights and constrains the government's ability to infringe upon them. And so while the Constitution constrains the government, it's really important for private companies to be conscious of the liberty implications of their technology and the potential for their products to be abused to strip people of their natural rights, whether it's the right to free speech, their right to you know, meet and
to assemble,
exactly, to meet
yeah.
and associate with the people that they want to meet and associate with, to exist on their property and conduct themselves within the law, within their own backyard, and to, you know, just generally live their lives without the fear of government persecution. And so the liberty implications of geospatial, at least in the article that I wrote, are when you're collecting massive amounts of data, it is not yet clear how much that data can be used in the court of law to proactively prosecute and identify people as lawbreakers, right? And so we need to be conscious of the potential for the government to abuse that, whether it's mass surveillance of cell phone data and location data to understand where people are traveling, who they're traveling with, and where and what they're doing there, right?
So I have an example there. So something that I always sort of presented during COVID as the power of geospatial was this incredible visualization of the locations of phones during spring break and how they moved across the US over, you know, in the week after spring break ended, including overseas. It was an absolutely stunning dashboard with, you know, billions of data points. But I guess you're saying that that's an instance of, I guess, where one might have some concerns, I guess, if people's personally identifiable data wasn't stripped from those roving cell phone locations.
Precisely. So if people's personally identifiable information is included, the thing is as much as we try to limit and maintain the privacy of individuals, it doesn't take much to scratch below the surface and find out who that data point belongs to, whether it's their property, whether it's their cell phone, you know, anything like that. And so the concern isn't necessarily what are companies doing with this data in a private sense and how are they selling it with your consent, which is a whole different topic, right? There's a certain level of opting into cell phone data that I have. There's not a lot of opting into aerial data acquisition, street side acquisition of my house and my kids playing in my front yard or my backyard, and what someone could do with that if that data gets into the hands of either a you know, monopolistic company that is interested and has an imbalance of influence in local government or state government, or even in the hands of government authorities who are misusing that data to target people for police action, right? Like there's a process you need to go through in order to understand whether or not someone is committing a crime, and I think it behooves private organizations to be careful of the amount of data they're selling or delivering to government for those purposes and the way that that data is being used. Right.
Okay, so I have to ask if there's an opportunity here for companies to somehow advertise themselves to the public or stand out in the market as uniquely upholding the Fourth Amendment.
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. And I think there are a lot of companies that are probably doing that. The biggest one that comes to mind that everyone knows is I think Apple does a pretty good job of maintaining privacy and limiting its cooperation with warrantless searches. And that's really what it comes down to, right? Is if the government has a warrant, great. If the government does not have a warrant, you need to be careful about what information and data you're sharing with them.
I can't help but feel like I personally, I don't want to sound like some sort of paranoid individual, just sheer curiosity. It would be amazing if there was a dashboard that sort of inhaled your digital life. I don't know if you just gave it all of your accounts that you have or something. There's another potential privacy breach. But if the dashboard could somehow categorize all the platforms that you have an account against for, I don't know, like a, traffic light grading of potential Fourth Amendment breaches or, coming pretty close to the edge sort of thing. I don't know if I'm making sense, but
No, I think you are. I think, and honestly, the rise of privacy regimes or pro-privacy regimes around the globe, the GDPR in Europe, the what is it, the CCPA in California. I think there's a lot of energy and movement around privacy and understanding, and with the collection and aggregation of huge data on citizens, what are our privacy rights and how do companies need to conduct themselves in order to ensure people are maintaining or have a right to privacy or a right to opt out. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is a nonprofit or someone out there who's created that kind of dashboard. To be honest, privacy wasn't necessarily my field of focus. I just have a particular personal interest in maintaining liberty, right? Like I think the best systems and the best outcomes come from humans' ability to take risks and chances and operate in ways that are mutually beneficial with limited central organization and mandates. And essentially what I'm really getting at is like, how do we limit the use of violence in the world? And I think you do that by limiting the amount of government intervention that exists to its minimum viable state.
Well, I love the summary. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to say something. So we're both, at the risk of putting too fine of a point on this, we're both fathers of young children.
Yeah.
And the thought that was going through my mind was that, and this is not to point the finger at, this incredible program that you were describing before, but the sensors that your program deployed, as I understand it, had centimeter level resolution.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, again, at the risk of putting too fine of a point on it, but I'm going to say it anyway. Our children's or anybody's faces, as I understand, could have been recognized from that aerial imagery, or is it not quite high enough resolution?
The aerial imagery is not quite high enough.
Okay, at least you could detect children playing in the backyard. This is really sounding melodramatic here. I'm kind of hamming things up a bit just to, I guess, illustrate, maybe the worst violation that is possible here. And then from your street side data, people's faces, if the face scrubbing post-processing effect wasn't applied successfully, people's faces, including the faces of vulnerable members of society, such as children, can be detected. So this is a motivating aspect, as I understand it, for the kind of considerations you're talking about here.
100%. And Microsoft was really good about it. We automatically blurred faces before even our operators started QCing the data. So that was part of the processing pipeline that happened between field. It happened at ingest, right? So we would ingest the data, and one of the first steps was facial recognition and blurring. But even that, right? You're still, the raw data still includes the face, and the algorithm is still trained to recognize a face, right? And so although it's blurring it, it's that data still
Simultaneously,
exists
you
somewhere.
have all of the faces.
That's right.
So
That's right.
yeah, wow.
But there was also a process where folks could call in or email and or submit a ticket and opt out and have their house blurred or their car blurred. So, we would proactively blur license plates, faces, things like that. But there was also a process where people could opt out.
Okay. All right. I feel like there is a whole other podcast episode here. I think we've covered the basis. Is there anything else you wanted to sum up from that LinkedIn article before we hit the next item?
No, I think the point of my article wasn't necessarily like let's pump the brakes on business and the data that we're acquiring. It's just I think we should be thoughtful and intentional about what we're doing with that data and how we're acting to create a better system, right? It's not just we are solving this one discrete problem and we're going to bring whatever data we need to bear in order to solve this discrete problem. It's also what are the externalities that we will be creating by generating this data and producing this data and providing it out for people to consume. And you're not always going to be able to avoid those externalities, but I think if we are thoughtful about it on the front end, we could do a lot to mitigate the harms that could come from, I don't know. I've been seeing articles these days, more and more lately about, different AI products, admonishing or telling their subject to go and do self-harm, or there's these stories coming up where it's like, how much do we really have control over these algorithms and the things that are being produced with them? And that is concerning, but it's still not as concerning to me as, okay, with this data aggregation, what could the government do with that? Because, as much as we do need a government, historically, governments are the biggest perpetrators of violence and infringers on human rights in history. So we just need to be thoughtful about how we go about those transactions and the systems that we're building.
Yeah, yeah. Overall, I really loved what you said about liberty, and that, in my mind, is a way that the US particularly stands out in the world. So yeah, I'll bring it back to a way for companies to stand out, geospatial companies to stand out in being uniquely concerned for the welfare of their users. A great way to get people on board is to directly confront how the company, in the context of collecting and leveraging geospatial data, is supporting and expanding the liberty of users.
I agree. Yep. Yeah,
Okay.
and the community as generally, right? Yeah. I think that's important.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm blowing the whistle about human rights abuses on NEOM. This is a large set of projects in a northwest province of Saudi Arabia. I have taken to publicly accusing some Western publicly traded engineering consultancies of participation in the atrocities there to do with treatment of tribal landowners and construction workers in contravention of their own human rights policies. So I'm a green card holder. I'm a foreigner in the US. Does the First Amendment protect me in this speech, and how much?
That's a super interesting question. And again, I'm going to bring it, and just to be clear, again, I know this is annoying, but I am not a lawyer. I'm not giving legal advice. But in my personal opinion, I think the First Amendment is one of the most interesting of them.
Maybe we could also have an explanation of what the First Amendment is.
Yeah, exactly. So the First Amendment, it limits the government's ability to regulate or infringe upon the freedom of speech, the press, assembly, and religion. There are very limited exceptions to what the government is allowed to do to regulate these activities. And they usually involve direct harm. Like for speech, there's defamation laws where you can't just say lies about people in printed or verbal words that would harm them. You can't, like fighting words. You could be prosecuted for fighting words, or
Is
the
this
incitement
literally
of.
threatening to physically harm someone,
Um,
or that they
yeah,
should be harmed by others, or
fighting words has like a very specific and contextual definition. So it's like if you're at a bar and you say um, like really derogatory things at someone that a reasonable I don't remember the exact standard, but it's something to the effect that a reasonable person would take them as to the point where it's like you should expect to be punched in the face by saying those things. Um, like you can't just say, well, but fighting words there's an exception for fighting words. Like child pornography, you're not allowed to do that. That people argue that that's speech. There's a number of exceptions, but essentially what the First Amendment does is it restrains the government's ability to prosecute you for certain levels of speech, but it does not, and it only applies to you when you're for you specifically when you're on U.S. soil. Right? You can't, if you're in Saudi Arabia, you can't enjoy the benefits of the First Amendment, and it only applies to government action, right? So your employer could take action against you if it's against their workplace policies. Other private people could take action against you if they think that your speech falls outside of one of the exceptions, and um, foreign countries might have different laws and take differently to them, to where the point where you could be prosecuted if you step on their land. The First Amendment would not protect you from their action against you. So very limited, but the most interesting thing about the First Amendment, in my opinion, is it is a recognition of a fundamental human right. And so for me, the definition of fundamental human right is rights that inherently exist, that do not require the work or labor of anybody else in order for us to enjoy. Right? It's a very limited set of rights, but speech, assembly, and religion easily fall within a fundamental human right.
okay. So I take it to mean that even though I'm not a citizen, I enjoy the First Amendment protection.
Yes, absolutely. You enjoy First Amendment protection while you're on U.S. soil, um, and
Okay.
the government can't prosecute you unless your speech falls within one of those exceptions. And whistleblowers they also enjoy, if you follow a particular process, they enjoy a even higher level of statutory protection. I think Sarbanes-Oxley is the act there, and I have to admit. Constitutional law, while I do love it, it is a passion of mine. It's not something that I practice, and it's more of a cursory philosophical level of legal expertise I have when it comes to the First Amendment or the
Okay.
constitutional generally.
Okay. Good to at least have another avenue for me to investigate. Okay. I recall from some of our earlier conversations that you mentioned sort of four different ways that you might be able to influence a situation. You mentioned norms before in explaining how you incentivize your team to map America.
Yeah,
But I think there was three other approaches you said could be taken. One was markets, I think.
yeah, absolutely. So the modalities of change, and let me give credit where credit is due. Um, this comes from, and I used to have his name off the top of my head. Um, but there are four modalities of change. Uh, you can influence things with market forces, legal and regulatory forces, normative forces, or architectural forces. So markets, that's transactional. Typically these days, it has to do with monetary forces, right? So if you want someone to work more, you pay them more for the work that they're doing, right? So, in the Microsoft example, we wanted to incentivize people to put in extra hours. So not only did they get the legally required overtime and double time pay once they reached certain thresholds, they also received bonuses for reaching those thresholds, so that they would receive a financial incentive for behaving that way.
So you stood out in the job market for those employees, so they kept coming back to give you their labor.
Exactly. And so we incentivize folks through market forces to work longer than they might otherwise work, right? And through regulatory and legal forces, that I think is pretty self-explanatory. You don't want people speeding through a neighborhood, so you create speed limits and police officers to catch people speeding through neighborhoods. Now, that's also, like, if you want to apply that to the employment scenario, like the Microsoft example, the legal and regulatory forces were more on the employer than the employee, and so we were required to pay overtime and double time for reaching certain hourly allotments, right? And so that's how you limit. There are certain limitations on employees and how they can treat their employers and how they can treat their employees. Normative forces, right? This is things like social norms, like what is polite society. Like we mentioned in the Microsoft example, the team was celebrated for working more. Our leaders, I was there every day at like 3 or 4 a.m. and didn't leave until the following day, very, very late. And so, like, being there and walking around and saying hi to people and greeting them, it's not that I was saying, why aren't you at your desk? It was just, when more people are doing the thing, more people tend to do the thing, right?
Gotcha.
So norms, I think, are actually one of the most powerful ways that you can influence behavior and outcomes. And then there's architecture. Architecture is the physical environment. This could be like elevation, right? When you're building an interstate, what is the elevation and the grade that you're looking to achieve, and what are the things in your way, and how can you move those things in order to achieve the outcome that you need? Or bringing it back to the Microsoft example, the architecture of the space, right? This is one of the, because we were limited in the amount of space that we had to accommodate additional operators in our workforce, we resorted to market and normative levers of change in order to incentivize the workers that we could fit in the space to achieve the level of output that we needed, right? And so not only did we architect a space where there was rooms dedicated for people to take rests, so they didn't have to drive home after a long day. We also made snacks and catered food and made it comfortable for people to be in that environment for the period of time that they were being incentivized to work, right? So we created an architecture around this team in the organization to help influence and drive that outcome that we were looking for. And so that's what Peace, Love, Freedom, that's what we help our clients do, is navigate the market, regulatory, normative, and architectural frameworks necessary in order to achieve their objectives.
Gee, I feel like I've come to exactly the right management consultant, Jordan.
I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, no, it's amazing timing. This gives me a lot of power, I feel, in approaching this issue in a productive way that is biased towards solutions.
Yes.
There's this whole episode has been about remotely sensed data, and some sort of processing pipeline to derive meaning from that. You can see these building footprints behind me. An example of this kind of analysis for the issues to do with treatment of tribal landowners in Tabuk province is, there was a BBC article about a village called Sharma, and I looked at the imagery in Google Earth showing a good number of buildings in this village, of the order of 500 at a glance, up to mid to late 2020. And then I think it was September 2021, the vast majority are gone. Maybe there's 20 sort of municipal type buildings left. All the residential dwellings have been totally cleared. And this BBC article that really, to me, fundamentally changed my perception of the validity of the claims of these dominant Western engineering consultancies that it was okay for them to participate. The key sort of factor in that article was that there was a Saudi army lieutenant or something, a commander, that was sent with the command to kill villagers who refused the order to vacate their land. And in those operations, in fact, one man was shot to death. And reports are that of the order of 20,000 tribal landowners were forced off their land over a month or years long sort of campaign of harassment. So my saying all of those things and mapping it onto this framework you've put forward, if you just look at it from the perspective of norms, having that as a norm for land acquisition for projects would be rejected out of hand, would almost lead to a revolution if that happened in the West. You know, the incredibly polite, controlled way that compulsory land acquisition occurs on infrastructure projects, and I've been involved in them for massive transmission power lines, hundreds of kilometers long in Australia. I was the GIS lead who maintained all the land ownership data and did the spatial analyses for all the landholders that would be affected and the proportion of their holdings that would be affected and things like that. The amount of analysis and the care with which the law is adhered to in that context is incredible. And it's those same companies that deliver on those kind of projects in Australia simultaneously that are involved in a context where those norms have been dramatically violated. It would appear in Tabuk province. So it's useful for me to hear that framework laid out so that I can begin to classify the kinds of violations that have occurred. Another one in terms of architecture for me is that they're over there. You know, they wear strange clothes called dish dashers. These white, incredibly useful, actually, gowns for the climate. When I lived in Kuwait, I actually bought a dish dasher, and I actually really enjoyed wearing it. And the massive pockets that they have down the sides, you can put all sorts of things in there. You know, and I have to say, this is going to sound really strange for a man, but you feel like you're gliding around when you wear one of these things, like not having pants.
I love it. I wish it was more normal.
Speaking of norms,
yeah, anyway, exactly.
So just to say, and I also I bought a shamak when I was in Oman. You know, often we use derogatory terms, and we call them the tea towel head. You know, but actually those things again are incredibly useful for the hot climate there. Because it protects your head. You can put a bit of water on it. Sometimes, not often, but just the whole the attire is, when you're there, you understand, you know, why you wear it. So just to try to humanize these people a bit is why I'm saying that. But for the average person, you can't blame them in the West. You can't blame them for feeling that in a visceral way, from an architecture perspective, to use your framework, they are over there. And therefore harder to humanize and harder to feel that those norms have been violated quite to the degree that that feeling might occur if it was people who weren't dressed that way over there practicing a different religion. So to me, the concept, that the architecture part of your framework offers explanatory power here for this phenomenon as well. And markets, you know, that's, you know, if it is perceived by those who offer these companies work that enough of a norm violation has occurred.
That's right.
And enough of taking advantage of architectural issues or differences or limitations has occurred. Perhaps there could be implications in terms of their participation in Western markets.
Yeah.
That thought occurs to me. And in terms of legal, well, it's down to whether they have misled market participants, possibly, because some of these companies, they're signatories to the UN Global Compact, one of them. Yeah. They all have codes of conduct. One of them has a publicly available human rights policy, which says things like, we do not lend momentum or our image or our authority to situations where people's human rights have been violated. And I believe the case can be made that that has occurred, and yet they have chosen to nevertheless participate. They also say in the human rights policy that they do due diligence to avoid involving themselves in these situations. So, yeah, just to map this situation onto that framework is useful for me. So thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like you mentioned, I think geospatial technology has a huge role in driving the levers of change necessary to achieve that outcome of desirable human rights and protecting them, right? And I think so. Like you mentioned, having the ability to remotely sense what's going on the ground and measure these changes and observe and demonstrate to the global community the violation of norms in order to trigger that market reaction, right? That's where I think the architecture of having satellites that exist beyond terrestrial jurisdictions is pretty important.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned the UN, and unfortunately, I think laws and regulatory mode of change in this instance is probably the least likely to have any effect. The international law is not really a thing. I mean, there are international lawyers out there, but usually it relates to like conflict of laws, and when it comes to a contracting scenario, the UN has very limited capacity to actually enforce those treaties, and even the ICJ, right? Very limited capacity to enforce those facets of international law
Yeah.
that we wish that they could.
Yeah, so I really like what you said there about how, nevertheless, a geospatial analysis may be used to trigger some further steps. So what
Exactly.
springs to mind for me? I mean, there's many ways to derive building footprints, and boy, would I love to be able to use the processing pipeline that you guys had But anyway, the one that I have heard of is support vector machines to classify from a training data set a raster input into things that are what the training data set was about and things that are not. And I came across a tutorial actually for running that kind of analysis over a raster input to get at least built up areas. Another thing to say is that the Overture Maps Foundation, that funnily enough Microsoft supports, has a global building footprints data set with of the order of 1.2 billion records in it. So of course, what I did was I went to this village, Sharma, and lo and behold, I can tell you that the building footprints data set from Overture Maps Foundation is at least 3 years out of date because it has of the order of 500 building footprints at this location. But that's actually really useful, and I'd love to now go and actually get that data from Overture Maps because that gives us a baseline that someone's already derived, and now we can just run the same processing pipeline over current data and show that there are vastly fewer of these building footprints. And that to me brings up how meaningful and powerful this building footprints data set could be for advocacy, because someone could just run through in a global sense, and maybe there are actually people in the UN who would be able to tell us this, where all the vulnerable tribal communities are around the world. And it can just be someone's job to periodically monitor changes to the building footprints within these tribal communities. And then perhaps there can be a body that can be reported to about these changes at the UN, or that has sufficient amount of power and media exposure to ask the question why these changes occurred and what projects, for example, are nearby. And were there any abuses that occurred along with the removal simply of these polygons from these areas of interest from virtual maps, foundations, building, footprints, data set?
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. And I think you're right. It could be used in that way. You could definitely leverage the technology. Something that came to mind when you were describing the use case is it might be an over-engineered solution to that use case. Right? I think one of the things we try to help our clients with is, do you really need that computationally intensive workflow to achieve the outcome that you're desiring? Or could you run an analysis on satellite data and identify specific areas of interest that you were talking about, right? And then just check them with satellite data on a regular basis. Like, you don't necessarily need a building footprint
to go to the derived
right?
product. Sure. Yeah, there's
Exactly,
plenty of change detection, land cover change detection. Yeah. Land use
exactly.
and land cover change detection on just the raster imagery that you can do. Yeah.
And so, I mean, but it depends, right? So if that's something you have the operational capacity to do, is have someone go and look at those things, you could do that. You could also automate that change detection if you wanted to. Where I would see the building footprints coming into play, yeah, I don't know. I tend to think of building footprints not as something that you want to add data to, not understand that data is being subtracted. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Say that again.
So I think while you could count the building footprints, like, I think of building footprints as a foundational data layer to adding things to your data set, whether it's moving the address point into the center of the building, or creating a footprint that you can then combine with elevation data and a DSM to get building heights and actually start to build a 3D environment. And then you can start moving towards that digital twin, understanding how wind moves through a space, how water would move through a space, how you could monitor the risk of falling trees, all sorts of different things around having like a three-dimensional object. I mean, there's a lot of two-dimensional building footprint applications as well, like where's the front door?
Yeah, I'm basically using it as a proxy for the presence of tribal landowners.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
no,
you're
I think,
saying
and I
that
think
there are
that
many things to use as that proxy.
Exactly, and building footprints I think, is an expensive way to achieve the result that you're looking for, and you could achieve that result in a lot more efficient manners.
Yeah, I mean, I've also, because I'm at the point now where, because I've done about 50 episodes, so I've had encounters with a number of different processing platforms, web mapping systems, things like that. One that springs to mind is Whereabots. As I understand it, they're basically elastic compute or vastly scalable compute that can inhale planets. And they have a lot of examples, like Will Lyon talked about an application for global raster imagery processing. So it would be, I feel like, an incredible expression of what the geospatial community can do, and that it can't be messed with in its steadfast support for the vulnerable.
Yeah.
If we brought to bear something like Whereabots upon, or put at the disposal of these individuals in these vulnerabilities, a tool such as Whereabots, wouldn't that be an incredible illustration of how much of a heart the industry has?
I think so. But I also, I don't mean to just knock down any ideas. For me, it's how do we achieve the objective while also maintaining a sustainable way to achieve it over the long run, right? And so while Whereabots, I think when you're operating at scale and you don't have the operational capacity to visually look and inspect a satellite image, and you need to automate things across large areas and large populations, and are expecting rapid change, I think those kinds of engineering solutions make sense if, and I mean, this is an insensitive phrase to use in this context, but I can't think of a better one. Unfortunately, is the juice worth the squeeze, right? And so, if you can fund that computationally intensive process, that's fantastic.
Yeah. Or you could
But
just
if
have a
you could,
WhatsApp number for village representatives for these 5,000 villages around the world and a globally a WhatsApp group and just a message. Hey, we're we're losing. We're
well,
being
no,
sent away. Yeah, I get what you're saying. I get what you're
but I
saying.
think it is important. I think the baseline that you mentioned is an important one, right? Having that open data that already exists is important. Um, it's but if you and this is one of my biggest criticisms of the environmental geospatial movement is, it's not cheap to process all of this data, and the impact of the data centers on the environment and communities um, is not small. So do we
Hang on.
really
I'm
need these
gonna
solutions?
I'm gonna come back with some devil's advocacy for your devil's advocacy. Perhaps at the risk of sounding indefensibly idealistic, shouldn't the systems be designed to cheaply analyze these things? Shouldn't it be that it is incredibly easy to get answers about these critical questions? And isn't it a sign that perhaps we are biasing things in the wrong direction if it's incredibly expensive to get answers about protecting the most vulnerable?
I think this is an architectural hurdle more
Or
than
is it that
more than anything else.
for a lot of the time, in fact, our industry is set up to facilitate the vision of the rich and the powerful?
Well, I don't think it's as nefarious as that. I think it really just comes down to architecture and the moving of bits and the need to have physical infrastructure and energy infrastructure to accommodate the number of bits that we're moving, right? And so it's yes, because the rich and powerful are able to finance and build these capital intensive uh, projects like data centers in Georgia, right? I just read an article today about Blackstone building a data center in Georgia,
I'll have to go and check it
and
out.
how yeah, it's I mean it's really it kind of is a nice parallel to this conversation, right? They bought a 600 acres. They're building this big data center, uh, but there was some miscommunication between the town and the private equity company that's building the data center and the utility that's going to service the data center, and there was some representation or some understanding on the side of the town that the energy infrastructure existed in order to service that massive data center. But it turns out it does not. And so they'll need to build new transmission lines across a community in order to facilitate this massive data center. And so it's like, okay, well, that
And
has
nobody
huge
wants to have their
implications.
house under a transmission power line.
Nobody wants their house under a transmission power line. Not only do you have to sacrifice a lot of the natural environment that exists, like trees and waterways and things like that, but you're decreasing home values. When you're adding a single customer into an ecosystem that's being serviced by a utility that dominates a vast majority of that energy consumption, will they maintain their thoughtfulness and
Yeah.
consideration and service to the other customers?
But this provides such a great point of contrast because
Exactly.
the consequences for some of one thing I didn't say in characterizing the problem before shifting on to solutions was that in Saudi, 5 of these tribal landowners, not only was one shot, 5 are on death row. So this provides a fantastic contrast to what the future holds for these individuals who are in the way of this data center in the US, where there are different norms.
Yeah, different legal regimes for sure. But I think what's interesting to observe in both of them is there is a power structure that exists, and the folks who want to make things happen, if they have enough control over the systems of power, they're going to happen, right? And so in Saudi Arabia, unfortunately, their legal avenues consist, it sounds like, and I haven't checked this, I don't know, they could legally persecute someone to the point of putting them on death row in order to move them from the land. I'm not sure if that's a direct causal relationship there, or what happened, but in the United States, eminent domain, right? Like if there's a public good, they can take your land. I mean, they have to compensate you a certain degree, but it's not the same, right? So at the end of the day, there are legal avenues for the rich and powerful to take things from people who don't have as much, and do what they want. But I guess my point, to circle back, is like the way that we've built. I think the dirty secret in not just geospatial but in the tech industry at large right now is that AI isn't, while it's operating within a black box, and we don't necessarily understand how it's achieving the outcomes. I mean, we do and we don't. It's not like a really, and I don't want to take anything away from the brilliant engineers who are working hard to create these things, because it is really impressive. It truly is. But it's not like an elegant, sophisticated, like thinking machine that it's big data. It's big data.
So I can contribute here as well. My first degree was psychology. Something that stands out to me in this flourishing of so-called artificial intelligence is I haven't heard a single clinical psychologist who spends all day long administering intelligence tests for purposes of classifying school children into, different intervention streams, for example, which is why intelligence tests were invented. I haven't heard a single qualified clinical psychologist commenting on the ability of these machines to think. Furthermore, they, in fact, as you said, don't think. There is no abductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, or numerical reasoning going on. It's all big data. You're absolutely right.
And so, and that's really my point on these environment, especially with regard to the environment, right? So, while it would be, I think, and you mentioned something before, and I don't mean to be pedantic about it or grok on it, but you mentioned the word should, right? It should be like this. But to me, should represents the gap between expectations or desires and reality, right? And so, as much as we'd like it to be like that, the fact of the matter is, to fuel these algorithms and to produce the outcomes that we're getting right now, it requires storing and processing and moving huge amounts of data. And while a lot of people have this notion that data exists in like some metaphysical cloud, it actually exists in a physical location somewhere, right? That it must be housed. And it requires massive amounts of energy, massive amounts of computational resources that require massive amounts of physical materials to build those resources. They're not always put together in the most ethical of ways, right? Like cobalt is a critical component to a lot of these processing infrastructures, and most of the cobalt is mined by very less than ethical companies, right? And so, as much as I'm an advocate and am bullish on the ability for technology to solve problems, I also really want to be careful of not over-engineering solutions to problems that we can derive in less computationally intensive ways, right? Because we need to be conservative of our energy resources. While I think I'm a big advocate of expanding our ability to leverage our energy resources, we shouldn't just be throwing it away and being wasteful, right? Gotcha. And so if we can solve the problem by taking a satellite image and having someone review it with higher efficiency and less costs and less externalities than processing building footprint pipeline, I think we should probably do that.
Got you. The point is well taken. Step away from the glowing silicon altar.
Yeah, exactly. And don't get me wrong. There are a lot of efficiencies and benefits to it, but I don't think it's the end all be all that a lot of folks are putting it out to be.
Yep, I love it. Okay, so the final question. If you were to hire an apprentice at Peace, Love, Freedom, what qualities would get them the job?
I think I look for people who are hungry, who have a desire and a passion for what it is that they're doing and are hungry to do more. I think to circle back to the skin in the game, right? It's folks who are willing to put skin in the game and improve it, right? Like let's add value together. Add value before you get value. Don't get me wrong, I'm not looking to just extract things from folks, but I think a level of earning things is important. I would much rather have someone who is hungry and willing to learn and has an open mind than someone who has a bunch of certifications and a fancy education.
That
But
counts
that
me
being
out then.
said, someone who has critical skills and demonstrates a history of learning, I think is super important. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's all about values to me, and so for me, my company values are the lens through which I expect my employees and partners and interns or whoever it is who's working in my ecosystem to analyze decisions so that they can make decisions independently. I really don't want to be in the business of micromanaging, so I really like to do a thorough job of hiring and partnering up front to find people who are able to work independently and make decisions with our company vision and values in mind. I'd like
What are those? Sorry to cut in.
yeah. So I have a list of 9 values, and they build up into peace, love, freedom. So peace, love, and freedom each have 3 supporting pillars. So under peace, it's maintaining personal and professional integrity, voluntarily exchanging value. I think that one is so important to me. I think the world remains peaceful when you have consenting interactions, right? And so that's why I want to limit government interaction and reliance as much as possible because there's less consent in those interactions. And striving for the win-win-win. And so those 3 support the peace. Love is working intelligently and with discipline. And so I think when you're doing that, you tend to do that in things that you really love to do, right? And so I want to work with people who love what they're doing, continually improving so that you can, continue to love what you're doing, and paying it forward so others can gain and appreciate what it is that you're doing. And then the last 3, they support the freedom pillar, and this is transparently and consistently communicating. I think freedom really depends on cooperation and friendly interactions, and we get that through transparency and consistency and through open communication. Pushing decisions to the nodes. I think this is kind of what I started with, right? Is like I want the people that I work with to be able to make decisions independently and not have to ask me every time for everything, because I think that constrains innovation and constrains our productivity. So allowing the people who are closest to the data to make decisions and act is generally more beneficial for organizations. And then the last one is living it to understand it. This you'll hear people say, eat your own dog food.
I've heard that
but
one.
but I think it's so important for leaders and whoever it is running and working in an organization to have some experience with those downstream data consumers or producers and the upstream parts of the workflow, so that they understand who it is that they are receiving their work items for, or producing work items or products for, so that not only can they empathize with their coworkers or vendors or customers, but they can act and make decisions that will benefit them the most, right? So living it to understand it, I think, leads to a lot better outcomes, and you can work a lot more freely when you have that buttressing your perspective.
So this has been a really useful addition to the series of conversations I've had over a year and a half running the podcast, because most of the episodes have been about structuring data, structuring some sort of analysis to do with answering a geospatial question. This has been about structuring people, it seems. That's been a theme. And I just love the 2 frameworks now, really. those 9 sort of values underpinning peace, love, freedom, but also this norms, market, legal, and architecture sort of framework that you talked about as a basis for detecting opportunities for change. To me, the fact that there's a participant in our industry that brings the concepts that you have to bear says that our industry does serious, large-scale things. So I really love the messages. I hope people listen up and use this as preparation for when they confront a really large task, like you participated in executing on for Bing Maps.
I appreciate that a lot. Yeah, and I think it's what you said just now is the double-edged sword of the industry. It is geospatial is so embedded in everything that happens globally, right? Because everything exists somewhere, and there is a part of almost every business system, no matter how sophisticated or how complex or how simple, that has to do with where things are and how do you move them to where they need to be in order for them to be productive and generate value. And so while geospatial is so critically important to operating and running the world and moving food and resources to where people consume them and can benefit from them, it's also one of the least known industries out there. You know, when there's a running meme in the industry when you try to tell people what you do, it's like, oh, you know, Google Maps, right? And I mean, that's something
my
that people
go-to.
can grab onto, but it's so much more than that, right? It is so much more than that. And there's a huge system and ecosystem underpinning the industry that I think is really awesome. And I think that's one of my favorite parts of being a participant in the industry is getting to work with people who are just incredibly talented and genuinely love what they do. And I think, I've worked in a lot of different verticals and industries, whether it's construction or law, residential, real estate, and I can say from my experience, I haven't worked with people who love what they do as much as geospatial.
It is renewed every time I record one of these episodes, and that's definitely the case. Now, I've got one cheeky last question, Jordan. Can you send a few photos of you operating a backhoe? Because my understanding also is that you have enjoyed, the odd earth-moving operation. And to me, I don't want to tease you too much here, but I think the case can be made that perhaps you're a bit of a Renaissance man in our industry, Jordan. From law to backhoes to geospatial, planes, cars, the whole lot. So here we are. This is the man.
I'd love to. Yeah, if I'm looking through my pictures and see if I have a good one.
You have to.
I do love it. I consider myself a bit of a geomancer. Seriously,
there we go.
It's I love digging dirt and working in spreadsheets and reading contracts. It's like kind of bizarre, but it's really fun. So
all at once. All right. So if you combine all of those in one photo, I'll make that the thumbnail.
Yeah. And QGIS. I forgot to leave that. I forgot to throw that in there. Right.
Good stuff. All right. Cool. Yeah. Great to connect. So is it peacelovefreedom.com or what?
Yes, sir. peacelovefreedom.com. Jordan Regenie. That's Regenie. You can find me on LinkedIn. And I have the LiDAR nerd handle on X.
And also the 3DEP hashtag on LinkedIn. It seems.
Pretty much, yep. 3DEP hashtag on LinkedIn.
Sweet.
3DEP.
Excellent.
Cool.
Great. I'll catch you around. Jordan, thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Will. I appreciate it. Have a great one.
You too, man.